Greetings. Well, this is Josh Brahm, and I have another article to read to you. This one is from a few years ago, but I added it to the list because not only is it an article about a very specific change that we made to our the display that we've been using for our outreaches in the last few years, a change that we is one of those kind of test things that we ultimately kept, and an idea that I had that I'm proud of. But more importantly, I think the greater takeaway has to do with the way that we got to think about pro-choice people and how that change in thinking can ultimately improve the way that we interact with them and make it easier for them to hear us. So, without further ado, this is an article that I wrote called "A Simple Change That Instantly Communicates a Nuanced Approach to the Abortion Debate." It was only 2 months after launching Equal Rights Institute last year before we facilitated our first outreach. We had our training seminar developed by then, but we hadn't yet had the opportunity to design our own outreach tools. So we utilized our favorite poll table option that we learned during our work with one of our favorite pro-life organizations, Justice for All. The sign on the table asks, "Should abortion remain legal?" This sign always stops a good number of people who see it, giving us a chance to engage them in productive dialogue. This spring, my friend Dr. Charles Camosy reached out to me to ask me to preview his upcoming book, Beyond the Abortion Wars. It has now come out, and I would highly recommend reading it. We don't always agree with his conclusions, but even the places where we disagree are well-researched, well-argued, and well-explained, and they help me to think more clearly about my own beliefs. Charles Camosy is a very unusual, very interesting voice in the pro-life movement, and any pro-life advocate would benefit from wrestling with him. As a quick side note, this isn't in the article, but since writing this, I ultimately invited Dr. Charles Camosy onto our advisory board, and he accepted. So I talk with him every once in a while to get his advice on what we're doing, and I'm happy to call him a friend and a very good advisor. While reading Dr. Camosy's book, I came across this section. These are excerpts from pages 26 through 29. Our current abortion politics are part of a larger political structure in conversation. And at first glance, this structure looks hopelessly polarized. After all, it has been widely reported that Congress is now more polarized than at any point since the Civil War. But that description of Congress, much like our abortion politics, doesn't affect the complexity of what Americans actually believe. A recent Gallup poll, for instance, found the following breakdown in political affiliation in the United States. Very conservative, 9%. Conservative, 31%. Moderate, 35%. Liberal, 16%. Very liberal, 5%. And no opinion, 4%. This is hardly a polarized group of people. Only 14% are in the quote-unquote extremes. This is also true of our abortion politics. At first glance, especially viewed through the lens of the media, we seem hopelessly polarized, as if this is somehow a fight between those who, 1, want to ban abortion altogether in the name of stopping genocide, and 2, those who want to make all abortions legal in the name of women's equality. While some of the loudest voices in our public abortion debates hold these views, and while the media tend to tell their stories this way in order to generate ratings, Americans have views on abortion that are even more complex than their political views in general. This should not be shocking, of course, given the bizarre way that our abortion political categories and quote-unquote sides came to be formed. Dr. Camosy continues, "The poll numbers tell a very different story of what Americans actually believe. According to a 2013 CNN poll, for instance, Americans thought abortion should be always legal, 25%. Legal in most circumstances, 11%. Legal in few circumstances, 42%, and always illegal, 20%. This reality, of course, does not fit into our lazy and imprecise quote-unquote pro-life and quote-unquote pro-choice soundbite rhetoric. Hence, in summing up the views of Americans on abortion, we can safely draw at least 2 conclusions. 1, a very clear majority of Americans want to see abortion more restricted than it is now, especially the quote-unquote middle weeks of pregnancy. And 2, an overwhelming majority of Americans, including many who identify as quote-unquote pro-life, want to see abortion legally available in the exceptional 2% of pregnancies, rape or incest, and a threat to the life of the mother. I quote one more paragraph from Camosy's book. "We now have even more evidence that the categories we use to describe our abortion politics are woefully inadequate. Most Americans are quote-unquote pro-choice in some situations, and most are quote-unquote pro-life in some situations. In answering the question, do you support abortion, most Americans will respond, it depends on the situation. Indeed, we learned above that 70% of Americans say the term quote-unquote pro-choice describes them somewhat or very well, and nearly 65% simultaneously say the term quote-unquote pro-life describes them somewhat or very well. American abortion politics, at least in the general electorate, are complex and actually not polarized in the us versus them way they are commonly portrayed. Though some find themselves on the extremes of the debate, most are in the complex middle. End quote. I write, as you can see, polling data clearly shows that Americans' views about abortion are often complex and people don't always agree with either ends of the spectrum in the debate about abortion. For most people, the accurate way for them to respond to the question of whether abortion should be legal is, it depends. As soon as I read it, I thought of the Should Abortion Remain Legal poll table. The students who stop and talk to us, or the staff at Justice for All, can quickly tell that we understand that there is a spectrum of beliefs about abortion, that there are more than merely two positions people have on abortion. The problem is that the students who don't stop and talk to us may perceive our views to be much less nuanced since we were only putting yes and no options on the table. It looked like we were asking, which one of the only two possible beliefs about abortion do you have? I suspect that this was annoying for some passersby who chose not to stop and talk to us for that reason. After our staff discussed it, we decided the problem is not the question on the sign, but that we were only giving two options for people to sign. So we decided to add an It Depends option. Our first opportunity to try the new poll table was at UC Bakersfield this spring, and now this is a few springs ago. We were pretty excited about the idea going into the outreach, and we were ecstatic about the results. In order to make room for all three signs, we had to set up two folding tables, but we were surprised to find that actually made the table function better to facilitate more conversations. At times, we had 5 different conversations all taking place around the poll table because there was enough space for it. One concern we noticed was that our volunteers were more prone to standing behind the table, creating more of an us versus them visual. My preference is to get in front of the table, and when talking to a shorter person to actually sit on the table to show that I'm both relaxed and not trying to use my height as an advantage in the dialogue. Yes, I've seen tall guys do that. For example, this conversation, and I include a picture, I had later in the year at Portland Community College went really well. One of the 2 reasons the student that I will call Ariel told me she appreciated this conversation was my body language. I'll be talking about the second reason in a future article. One of the most interesting things about this table is that while students have told us they appreciate that we're giving more options, few actually sign the It Depends option. We suspect some of them feel like they'd be betraying the side they more closely identify with by signing It Depends. Even if they don't sign it, they are able to instantly tell something about us as soon as they see the table. We are respecting them by offering them all the options, so they can define their views on abortion legality with the terms they're comfortable with. And as of the time that I wrote this article, I write, we have only used the new poll table for about 30 hours of outreach, so we don't have scientific proof that the new table is better. But it is the unanimous opinion of our staff that adding an It Depends option has been an improvement, and it's very unlikely we'll go back to the old version. This new poll table has given us more dialogue opportunities, and those dialogues seem to start off on friendlier, more productive ground than they did before we added the third option. It's so easy to unintentionally come across like you think there are only 2 views about abortion. The little things we do matter. When I talk to people about abortion, I don't ask them if they identify with a label like pro-choice. I ask them to describe their own views about abortion. That tells me so much more about where they're coming from, and as I listen to them and learn more about their own views and how they came to believe them, I not only slowly build rapport as a thoughtful listener, but I'll also have a better opportunity to challenge the specific parts of their worldview most fundamental to their pro-choice position. This also prevents me from unintentionally implying that they are my nemesis.